So Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, looked at the signature line, noticed the empty chair where the independent legal advisor was supposed to be sitting, and slowly pushed the pen back toward King Charles. Not a delay, not a polite request for clarification, a direct refusal to sign. And that's where this whole thing gets genuinely interesting, because this wasn't some random outburst from someone who thrives on chaos. Sophie has spent decades being the royal family's quiet fixer, the person who shows up, does the work, and never causes a headline. So when she's the one closing the folder and saying, "I will not sign without legal counsel present," everyone in that room understood something serious had just been uncovered. The document was open. The witnesses were already positioned. Charles had taken his place at the head of the table, expecting a routine formality, and instead he got a confrontation that would expose how the machinery behind palace decisions actually operates. Before we get into the details of what was hidden in that agreement, and why the timeline makes absolutely no sense, make sure to subscribe to Palace Files so you don't miss updates on the story. King Charles had gathered household representatives inside a private Windsor estate office to finalize what should have been a straightforward transfer. The estate agreement was supposed to settle who would administer a protected crown property, who controlled it, who paid its costs, who carried responsibility for its future. Sophie had been expected to provide the final signature, the last step in a process everyone assumed was already settled. Charles slid the last page toward her and placed a silver fountain pen beside her hand. She read the signature clause once, then again, and the silence around that table must have been unbearable. Then she closed the folder and pushed the pen back toward him. Every witness understood the meeting had just fractured. Charles stared at her. He had expected questions, maybe some nervous hesitation, but not refusal. To him, the moment felt like a direct challenge delivered in front of his household. The monarch had already approved the ceremony, summoned the witnesses, and treated the transfer as complete. Her rejection threatened not only the agreement, but his command over the room itself. Sophie wasn't feeling defiant in that moment. She was feeling something closer to betrayal. Independent legal counsel, the separate advisor appointed to explain obligations without serving the king's private interests, had been promised at this meeting. That was the agreement, yet the advisor's chair remained empty, and no explanation had been offered. Nobody had said, "He's running late," or "We'll have him join remotely." The chair was just empty, and everyone seemed prepared to proceed anyway. Then Sophie found the clause that changed everything. The final draft gave the monarch's private office broader power over how the estate could be used, who could enter it, which staff could remain, and how responsibility might pass to future heirs. Those terms had not appeared in the copy she reviewed 2 days earlier. That's the detail that makes this so much more than a misunderstanding. We're not talking about a typo or a minor wording adjustment. We're talking about entire provisions that appeared between drafts. Provisions that shifted control and financial exposure in ways that would bind her and Edward for years. Charles demanded to know who had encouraged her to resist him. That question tells you everything about how he was processing this. He didn't ask what she had found or why she was concerned. He immediately assumed someone had gotten in her ear that she couldn't possibly have reached this conclusion on her own. Sophie met his anger without looking away. No one had instructed her, she answered. No one needed to. Then she reached into her case and placed the earlier draft beside the altered document. 2 versions, same agreement, different terms, sitting right there on the table. The refusal had stopped the signing, but the missing advisor and those changed pages were about to expose why Sophie had entered that room prepared to stand against the king. And honestly, when you actually look at what was said versus what happened, the whole thing falls apart in a way that raises much bigger questions about who was really controlling that document. Sophie had spent years becoming one of the monarchy's safest pairs of hands. She understood duty, discretion, and the heavy price of saying nothing when unity demanded silence. That's precisely why her refusal struck Charles so deeply. This was not a habitual rebel seeking attention, or someone who enjoyed creating friction. It was one of the family's most dependable figures deciding that obedience had reached its limit, and that signing the document could damage not only her future, but Edward's as well. She had built her place inside the royal family through reliability, not rebellion. She attended difficult engagements, supported the king during uncertain moments, and rarely allowed private discomfort to become public tension. That history mattered, because Charles could not dismiss her refusal as carelessness or a bad mood. When the trusted confidant pushed the pen away, everyone understood she had found something serious enough to risk years of goodwill. You don't throw away decades of being the reliable one over a minor disagreement. Edward understood the danger before the meeting even began. In the corridor outside the estate office, Sophie opened the revised agreement and pointed to the altered clause. The document would bind them to long-term maintenance costs, control of charitable access, responsibility for household appointments, and rules governing who might inherit future duties. Those were not ceremonial promises. They could shape their finances, their children's position, and their freedom for years. Edward read the wording slowly, then looked toward the closed door and asked the question that had probably been forming in his mind since Sophie first showed him the changes. Does Charles know this has changed? Sophie could not answer with certainty. That silence frightened him more than the clause itself, because if Charles did know, then they were being deliberately pressured into terms they hadn't agreed to. And if Charles didn't know, then someone else was rewriting documents in his name and counting on his authority to force compliance. Neither option was comforting. Edward feared that refusing the king might weaken their position within the family. He knew how quickly caution could be mistaken for disloyalty. Yet, he also knew his wife was being asked to accept obligations neither of them fully understood. The prince wanted to protect their standing, but he could not ask her to sign blindly, merely to preserve appearances. Sophie felt trapped between two loyalties. She wanted to protect Edward from conflict, but she also wanted to believe Charles would never knowingly place them in danger. Her sadness came from that broken belief. The monarch had always valued her judgment. Now, he seemed furious because she had used it. That's the part that makes this whole situation feel so off. If someone has spent years proving their loyalty and judgment, and then they raise a legitimate concern, the reaction shouldn't be anger, it should be curiosity. The fact that it wasn't suggests something else was driving the urgency. Charles remained alone after the meeting collapsed. He stared at the untouched signature line, his anger deepening because Sophie had neither hesitated nor apologized. Her certainty made the refusal feel deliberate, almost prepared. Edward then admitted something he had withheld. A senior palace official had quietly advised him not to ask too many questions about the revised agreement, because the king wanted the transfer completed quickly. That warning changed everything. Sophie began to suspect Charles's fury was not only wounded pride. Someone inside the palace was racing against the concealed deadline. To understand why the signing had suddenly become urgent, she would have to return to the estate visit where trust first turned into suspicion. The conflict had not begun at the signing table. Its true beginning came 3 weeks earlier during a private weekend inspection of the estate when Sophie opened a locked records cabinet and discovered that rooms intended for charitable work had been marked for restricted royal use. Charles had assured her that the property would remain a shared family responsibility. Yet, the papers inside that cabinet suggested something very different, and one tense conversation that afternoon ensured the issue could never again be treated as routine. Sophie and Edward had originally been asked to oversee a historic royal estate where charitable events could be held while selected rooms remained available for limited family use. The first agreement gave them operational responsibility but protected them from personal financial exposure. It also guaranteed independent legal review, meaning a separate advisor would examine the terms before either of them accepted binding obligations. That guarantee of independent review is crucial because it was the safeguard that would later be quietly removed. Sophie had entered the inspection expecting practical questions about repairs, staffing, and public access. Instead, she found a sealed property schedule inside the cabinet. A property schedule is the detailed list showing which rooms, entrances, and facilities belong under each person's control. Several private apartments, the archive room, and the estate's principal entrance were marked as exclusively controlled by the king's office. The discovery changed the meaning of everything. Sophie carried the schedule into the library and placed it before Charles. No aide stood between them. No secretary could soften the question. She asked why she and Edward were expected to accept responsibility for the entire property when they would have no authority over some of its most important spaces. That's a completely reasonable question. If you're being asked to manage and pay for something, you should probably have access to all of it. Charles read the page without visible surprise. He said certain areas had to remain under sovereign control, the monarch's direct authority over royal property, and warned her not to turn a practical arrangement into a test of trust. The king believed the restriction protected the crown. She heard something far more painful. Accept the burden, but do not question the power behind it. Sophie tried once more. She told him trust could not require her to sign first and discover the consequences later. Charles ended the conversation by closing the folder. That gesture became the point of no return. Later that evening, the palace legal advisor contacted Sophie through a documented private message. He confirmed that the restricted room schedule had not been attached to the version originally submitted for review. The warning proved the change was not minor. It altered who carried responsibility and who retained control. Days later, the same advisor disappeared from the final signing arrangements without explanation. The controversial schedule was then hidden inside a broader, more ambiguous clause. So, the person who flagged the problem was removed, and the problem itself was buried in language designed to be overlooked. That's not a coincidence. That's a sequence of deliberate choices. Sophie entered the meeting knowing exactly what had changed. Charles did not know she carried both drafts and the advisor's written warning. When those versions were finally placed side by side, politeness would collapse, and the king would have to confront her face to face. Charles expected resistance to soften once the room had emptied. Instead, Sophie became firmer. Behind closed doors, the king demanded that she return to the table and complete the agreement before the delay reached the wider household. She did not raise her voice. She did something more dangerous. She opened both drafts, pointed to the altered clause, and asked him to explain the difference. In that instant, royal fury met a form of resolve it could not simply command away. Charles dismissed the waiting officials and ordered Sophie to remain behind. Edward stayed outside, close enough to understand that the conversation had become deeply personal, but too far away to protect either of them from what came next. The monarch knew every delay threatened estate planning, staff appointments, scheduled charitable programs, and his wider property strategy. To him, one unsigned page could throw months of preparation into disorder. The king stood beside the table and told her to reopen the folder. Sophie remained seated. She placed the earlier agreement next to the final version and circled the new control clause with her finger. The difference was no longer hidden inside careful wording. It sat between them in black ink. Charles accused her of humiliating him before his household. He said she could have raised her concerns privately instead of refusing at the moment of signature. The anger in his voice carried more than authority. It carried injury, Sophie answered without retreating. Humiliation had never been her purpose, she said, but loyalty and family affection could not replace legal protection. The trusted confidant reminded him that the estate agreement would bind her and Edward for years. She could not accept obligations simply because refusing them made the room uncomfortable. Charles then asked the question she had feared. Does Edward support this? Sophie refused to let her husband become leverage. She told the king the decision was hers, the refusal was hers, and any consequence should fall on her alone. Edward would not be used to force her hand. Then she produced the written warning. Sophie explained that the missing legal advisor had contacted her through a documented private message and instructed her not to sign any revised agreement without independent counsel present. Charles read the words once, then again. His expression changed. The king appeared to know the terms had been revised, but not that someone had removed the very person expected to challenge them. That's where it gets weird. If Charles approved the revisions, why was the advisor removed without his knowledge? If he didn't approve the revisions, who authorized them? Either way, someone was operating outside the chain of command and using the king's authority as cover. Charles closed the folder with both hands and declared the signing suspended. Sophie looked directly at him. It was suspended when the advisor failed to arrive. Outside, Edward saw a senior official hurry away, carrying the unsigned agreement. The greater struggle had now moved beyond anger toward the officials controlling what Charles saw signed and believed. The monarchy often appears to move through the will of one sovereign, but no royal decision reaches a signature untouched. Behind Charles stood private secretaries, property managers, financial controllers, and legal advisors, each carrying a piece of authority that could be hidden inside a single sentence. Sophie's refusal exposed the machinery beneath the crown. The decisive question was no longer whether she had defied the king. It was whether someone had manipulated the agreement while relying on his authority to silence objections. Charles summoned the senior property secretary before the day had ended. The estate agreement had passed through property administration, private finance, household operations, and the monarch secretariat. That final office was the team responsible for preparing decisions and documents for the sovereign. Each department had touched the agreement, but only one of them had widened the disputed clause. The king placed both drafts on the desk. Did Sophie receive the version I approved? The secretary hesitated. He looked at the earlier copy, then at the final document, as though the answer might change if he waited long enough. It did not. No, sir. Charles said nothing. The secretary admitted that the wording had been expanded after the weekend inspection. He claimed the change was designed to protect sovereign control, meaning the crown's lasting authority over royal property, even if Edward and Sophie's responsibilities later passed to their children. Without that safeguard, he argued future family arrangements might weaken the monarch's control over the estate. Charles understood the concern. He did not accept the method. The king had final authority, but he relied on advisors to explain legal consequences, manage revisions, and ensure that every document matched what he had actually approved. Now, his command had been used to pressure Sophie into signing terms she had never properly reviewed. Anger gave way to something more painful: embarrassment. Sophie waited with Edward in a nearby drawing room. She could hear footsteps beyond the closed door, but no voices. The silence left her uncertain whether Charles was investigating the alteration or preparing to punish her refusal. Edward tried to reassure her, yet he could not hide his own fear that their place within the family had shifted. Then the secretary disclosed the final secret. The palace legal advisor had objected to the clause because it placed broad responsibilities on Sophie while limiting her control. He had demanded that she receive separate legal representation before signing. That demand had made the process slower, more difficult, and harder to control. So, he had been removed from the meeting. Let that sink in. The advisor was removed specifically because he insisted Sophie should understand what she was signing. That's not efficiency. That's obstruction dressed up as procedure. Charles stared at the admission. The choice before him was brutal. He could defend officials who had acted in the name of the crown or admit that Sophie's refusal had protected him from approving a deeply flawed arrangement. The king's fury had found a new target, but the unsigned document was already creating consequences neither he nor Sophie could contain. By the following morning, the estate was no longer preparing for celebration. Staff appointments were frozen. Invitations were withdrawn. A charitable launch scheduled for the following month vanished from the calendar. The unsigned document had become more than a family disagreement. It had stopped an entire royal operation. Yet, the greatest damage was personal. Sophie returned home, knowing she had protected herself, while fearing that Charles would remember only the moment she pushed his pen away. The palace formally paused the estate transfer until independent legal counsel could review the disputed clause. That meant no staff could be appointed, no spending could be approved, and no charitable program could move forward. Employees preparing to relocate were told to remain where they were, while several organizations received careful notices saying their events had been postponed. Sophie carried the estate briefing folder into her private room and removed it from her bag. For weeks, that file had represented trust, purpose, and a new responsibility she believed she could serve with pride. Now it felt contaminated by pressure. She placed it inside a drawer and turned the key. Edward watched her in silence. "You made the right decision," he said. Sophie wanted to believe him. Yet Charles's expression at the signing table would not leave her. She had seen fury, but beneath it, she had also seen hurt. The trusted confidant feared that one refusal had damaged a relationship built over years of service, loyalty, and private understanding. Edward reminded her that signing blindly would have damaged far more. He understood why she was shaken, but he also knew she had protected them both. Charles received the consequences in a list. An aide read the names of charities affected by the cancelled launch, while the king stood beside a window without interrupting. His anger slowly gave way to regret. The monarch had wanted the estate to become a symbol of stability. Instead, it had become evidence of disorder inside his own household. Then, an advisor suggested portraying Sophie as confused about procedure. Charles refused immediately. He knew that blaming her would deepen the injustice and force Edward to choose between defending his wife and protecting his place beside the crown. The king would not create that division merely to protect palace pride. Charles ordered a full legal audit, a formal review of every draft, email, handwritten instruction, and meeting record connected to the transfer. The results arrived later that day. One margin note stopped him cold. It instructed officials to secure Sophie's signature before separate legal representation could complicate completion. Charles read the sentence twice. Then he made an unexpected decision. He asked Sophie to meet him privately without Edward, lawyers, secretaries, or officials. For the first time since the signing collapsed, there would be no documents between them. Only Charles, Sophie, and the truth neither had been able to say. There were no aides outside the door and no folders waiting on the table. Charles had chosen a small private sitting room because he no longer wanted the conversation managed by officials. Sophie arrived expecting another demand. Instead, she found the king standing alone, holding the handwritten note that had encouraged staff to secure her signature before legal counsel intervened. His anger had not disappeared, but it had changed direction. What followed was not a royal command, it was a reckoning. Charles began without ceremony. He admitted that the final agreement had not contained the safeguards Sophie had originally been promised. Those protections mattered because they limited her financial exposure, secured independent advice, and prevented hidden responsibilities from being passed to Edward's family. The monarch explained that his true aim had been to preserve sovereign control, the crown's lasting authority over royal property, but the wording used by his officials had gone far beyond what he believed he had approved. The king placed the handwritten margin note on the table between them.
"You were right not to sign," he said. Sophie did not answer immediately. The trusted confidant had imagined hearing those words. Yet their arrival brought no triumph. She told Charles that the altered document had frightened her, but his fury had wounded her more deeply.
For years, she had served with discretion and loyalty. His reaction made her feel that all of it could be erased the moment she refused one command. Charles lowered his eyes. He admitted that he had felt challenged before his household and embarrassed by losing control of the meeting. The king had mistaken resistance for disloyalty because anger was easier than asking why someone he trusted had refused him. Then he faced the harder truth. Sophie had protected him from approving an arrangement that could have harmed Edward, their children, and the estate itself. Her refusal had not weakened his authority. It had stopped that authority from being used carelessly. Charles apologized directly. He did not blame pressure, advisors, or confusion. The monarch said he was sorry for demanding obedience before giving her the respect of a full explanation. Sophie accepted the apology, but she said clear conditions. She would reconsider the estate role only if independent counsel returned. Every hidden schedule was disclosed, and both she and Edward received the right to reject future amendments. Nothing would be signed through trust alone again. Charles reached into his pocket and removed the silver pen from the first meeting. For a split second, Sophie thought he might offer it back. He did not. The king placed it aside and told her the next signature would happen only when she was ready. Their private reconciliation repaired the personal rupture. Yet, outside that room, the palace still had to explain why the signing had failed and what consequences would follow for those who had manipulated it. The palace had hoped the suspended signing would remain an internal matter. It did not. By sunrise, one image had transformed the dispute into a national conversation. Sophie leaving Windsor with the unsigned blue folder held tightly against her chest, while Charles remained unseen behind the palace gates. The photograph carried no explanation, yet it seemed to capture everything: resistance, secrecy, and a family divided by a document. The monarchy now had to tell the world what had happened. Charles approved a brief palace statement confirming that the estate agreement had been postponed pending an independent legal review. That review meant outside advisors would examine the wording without pressure from the royal household. The statement did not blame Sophie, and that mattered. Any accusation against her would have deepened the family conflict and suggested the crown feared legal scrutiny. Royal correspondents immediately understood the scale of the moment. A senior family member had refused to approve a crown property agreement without proper safeguards. Crown property referred to an estate connected to the monarchy rather than an ordinary private home. So every clause carried financial, legal, and symbolic weight. The morning newspaper made the story impossible to contain. Sophie said no, stretched across the front page above the photograph of her leaving Windsor with the unsigned folder. A palace car waited behind the trusted confidant, but Charles remained hidden from view. The image made her appear isolated, determined, and burdened by a decision the public had only begun to understand. A broadcaster then stood outside Windsor Castle during a live report and placed enlarged copies of both agreements side by side. She traced the altered clause, explained how it expanded Pal's control, and asked why the legal advisor had been removed before the plan signing. Sophie watched the coverage beside Edward and grew visibly uncomfortable. Commentators called her a challenger to the king, as though she had attacked the monarchy itself. "You challenged the document," Edward told her, "not the crown." Sophie held on to those words, but the distinction was already disappearing beneath public drama. Charles felt the same frustration. Advisors urged him to issue a stronger denial and shut down claims of palace manipulation. The king refused. A forceful denial would conceal the legitimate reason the signing had stopped, and he would not protect authority by burying the truth. Crowds gathered near Windsor's public entrance. Several people carried handwritten signs praising Sophie for demanding legal transparency. Their support surprised the palace and made quiet accountability impossible. Then Charles authorized the final announcement. The senior property secretary who advanced the revised clause had been removed from the estate project pending a formal internal review. Public sympathy had moved towards Sophie. The king had accepted responsibility for the failed process. Only one act remained. The first meeting ended with a pen pushed away in anger. The final meeting would reveal whether the monarchy had truly learned why Sophie refused to touch it. Weeks later, the same room looked almost unchanged. The polished table remained. The silver pen had returned. But this time, every chair that mattered was occupied. Independent legal counsel sat beside Sophie. Edward had received the full agreement. Charles had personally approved each safeguard. The second signing was not a surrender by the king or a victory over him. It was proof that Sophie's refusal had forced the monarchy to choose between unquestioned obedience and responsible authority, and responsibility had prevailed. Charles opened the corrected document, but did not push it across the table. The revised agreement had removed the broad control clause, restored the promised legal protections, and clearly separated the duties belonging to Sophie and Edward from the areas retained by the sovereign. Those retained areas were the parts of the estate that remained under the monarch's direct authority, without placing their costs or risks upon the couple. Independent advisors addressed every obligation in plain terms. They confirmed the maintenance expenses, financial exposure, staff responsibilities, access rules, charitable commitments, and succession terms. The conditions deciding how duties could pass to another family member in the future. Nothing remained hidden. Nothing depended upon blind trust. Charles waited. Sophie listened until her legal advisor finished speaking. The trusted confidant reviewed the final page, looked toward Edward, and gave one deliberate nod. Only then did the king move his hand away from the document. Sophie picked up the silver pen. This time she signed without hesitation. Charles watched quietly. He did not rush her, interrupt her, or treat consent as a ceremonial detail. The monarch now understood that his signature only carried legitimacy when the person giving it knew exactly what it required. Edward signed next. The prince then placed his hand briefly over Sophie's, acknowledging what her refusal had truly achieved. She had not endangered their place within the family. She had protected their future, their children, and the trust holding them together. Consequences followed. The official who tried to secure completion without legal scrutiny was permanently removed from royal property negotiations. Charles also approved a new review procedure requiring full disclosure and independent advice before future family estate agreements could be signed. The king later acknowledged in a documented private account that his first reaction had come from pride and pressure. Sophie's resistance, he accepted, had come from responsibility. By refusing him, she had served the crown. Sophie did not celebrate the confrontation. Her relief came from knowing loyalty no longer demanded silence, and that trust had been rebuilt through accountability. Charles closed the completed folder and handed it directly to her rather than to an aide. The estate had been transferred. The family relationship had survived. Dignity had returned to both sides. Sophie's refusal did not weaken the crown. It prevented authority from becoming coercion. And in forcing the king to listen, she helped the monarchy emerge more disciplined, more accountable, and ultimately stronger.